Hello and welcome to the New Psychology of Depression, a series of programmes with me, Dr. Danny Penman, and Professor Mark Williams of Oxford University. We live in a world filled with material wealth. We have never had so much political and economic freedom. We live longer and healthier lives, and yet anxiety, stress, unhappiness and depression have never been more common. Why is this? Or perhaps more importantly, what can we do to stem the rising tide of these mental health problems? Mark, what exactly is depression?
Well, depression is a syndrome. It's a combination of symptoms that occur at the same time. So most people know what sadness is. Most people know sometimes how difficult it is to get out of bed out in the morning and this sort of thing. Depression is different from that. It's low mood, feeling hopeless, feeling very sad and listless, but also it can be lack of energy and enthusiasm for things that you used to actually quite enjoy. And those are the core symptoms of depression. But even then, if you get those for a couple of weeks and they go on and on and on, that's not enough to get you a diagnosis of depression. So there are other symptoms as well, and any combination, 4 or 5 of these other symptoms are often considered necessary for a diagnosis of a clinical depression. And they are things like changes in appetite, perhaps even weight loss, or sometimes people eat too much and weight gain, changes in sleep, so that some people don't get to sleep at night, or they can't sleep in the middle of the night, or they wake up very early in the morning. Occasionally, especially with something called seasonal affective disorder, it's sleeping too much and not, feeling that you want endless sleep. But generally with depression, it's not sleeping, it's insomnia. And then there are things like feeling guilty, lacking concentration, feeling agitated or very slowed down, feeling tired all the time, and even many people get suicidal ideas they'd rather be dead, that they're just a burden to the family. Now, what depression is these symptoms coming together most days for at least 2 weeks. In general, however, they go on for months, and that's when you'd get a diagnosis of depression, at the point at which these things prevent you from living your life as you want to live. So it's what might be called functional impairment. You can't function. And you can't explain it in terms of illness, physical illness. You can't explain it in terms of a recent bereavement. This comes and stays, and you don't seem to be able to get rid of it.
So how does it interrelate with other problems that we all suffer from time to time, such as anxiety, stress, and things like mental exhaustion?
Well, they're very closely related, so you very rarely get a depression without having other things like high anxiety at the same time. Depression is often characterized by dwelling on the past a lot, but you hardly ever get that without people also worrying about the future and being anxious about the future. Psychiatrists and psychologists usually put anxiety and depression in separate camps, but the new genetic evidence is suggesting they're much more dimensional, they're much more mixed, and also the treatments that work for depression tend to work for anxiety as well. So there's quite a lot of evidence that actually to make a too big a separation between anxiety, stress, depression, exhaustion isn't quite what is going on in the world.
Things like anger, irritability, road rage, typical explosions that you see, we all see every day. Are they related to depression at all?
They can be. I mean, they're more likely to be related to stress, because you often get, in high chronic stress, you get people showing a lot of anger, but also, and it depends on the age group. So, for example, in adolescent depression, there can be quite a lot of anger and irritability and hostility, which is how often within that age group a lot of sadness is expressed. But you couldn't get a diagnosis just from being angry all the time. You'd need some of these other things like weight loss or an appetite change, sleep change and that sort of thing.
Depression is increasing worldwide. Or is it increasing predominantly in the developed world, or is it also increasing in the third world?
Well, what we now know is that depression is rapidly becoming one of the biggest reasons for people to have basically lose years of their effective life through disability. The World Health Organization publishes data decade by decade over that, and about 2 decades ago they recognized that depression was becoming a big problem. Well, it's now arrived, so they have a statistic of the years life lost to disability, and in high and middle income countries depression is the top of the list for that. So it's higher than the disability caused by heart disease, for example, cerebrovascular disease, road traffic accidents. And even in low-income countries and very low-income countries, it's still in the top 10 of years lost to disability.
So depression actually exacts a bigger toll on society than cancer and heart disease and other things like osteoarthritis?
Indeed. In terms of its global impact, of course there's the suicide impact as well. Nearly 1 million people die prematurely by suicide each year across the world. But also there's the more hidden cost as well as the big cost of things like suicide. People feeling like they can't function, feeling like staying in bed rather than getting up, which is not just laziness, this is depression, as it were, that's doing this to them. It affects the ability to be a breadwinner for your family, the ability to look after your family, and that's why it's such a burden right across the globe.
Can you give us some figures as to the prevalence of depression, both in the developed world and the developing world?
So in high-income countries, for example, depressive disorders, which is what we've been talking about, account for about 14% of the year's life lost to disability. And putting that in proportion, if you look at Alzheimer's and other dementias, that's about 5% of the years lost to disability. If you look at osteoarthritis, it's 4%. If you look at chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that's about 3%. So 14% is huge compared with that. Then if you look at low and middle income countries, then depression is about 10% of that. And the next in line for the years life lost to disability are eye problems, what's called refractive errors, and that's about half that, about 4.7%. So again, in terms of the years life lost to disability, it's huge. What epidemiologists seem to find wherever they look is about 1 in 20 of the population are depressed at any one time, and about 20% of the population at some point will get very depressed, and that's a major problem.
Every time I hear these figures, I'm just completely stunned. What's the fundamental driving force behind the increase in depression?
I think there's always been a proportion of the population that has felt depressed. As far as we can go back in history, you can look in the Psalms, in the Hebrew, the Old Testament, as it were, the Hebrew, and you see people expressing, sadness and depression and anger and irritability and this sort of thing. You go back way into the beginning of something like Buddhism, for example, 500 years BCE, and you have people needing to learn to meditate to deal with the problems of the mind, the entanglements of the mind, as it were. So I think it's been around a long time. One of the things, however, that's new is over the last 50 years in the Western world, the age of onset of depression has changed. It's become earlier and earlier and earlier. And that's one of the major discoveries. It started to emerge from epidemiology, where big surveys started to pick up that people were beginning to report from about people born in the 1950s onwards. When they were assessed towards the end of the 20th century, they started to report that their depression had started a bit younger than we had previously thought. It was previously thought that depression was a bit of a late life problem, late 50s, early 60s. And indeed, the evidence that people born in the first part of the 20th century seemed to verify that. But decade by decade, from about 1950 or 60 onwards, the age of onset got younger and younger. And so by the 1980s and 90s, people were beginning to get depressed in their 20s. And there's been a striking confirmation of that in the last few years. One of the biggest clinical studies ever conducted was done in America. It was called the STAR-D trial, and it was ST, the beginning of STAR-D, it means sequence treatment. So it was a big trial to look at what treatment to provide one treatment after the other after the other. So they had 4,000 people who volunteered to take part. And as part of that trial, they were asking them, when did you first get depressed? And they found that the mean age of onset in this sample was about 26, but actually the most common age in which people started to get depressed was between 13 and 15 years old. And that is an astonishing new development.
Is the same true for kind of anxiety and stress and irritability? And
we weren't clear about that until about year 2000, where somebody published a big paper in one of the big journals in America. They'd traced the anxiety level of children and young people over the 30 years from the early 1950s all the way through to the mid-1980s. And they found exactly the same thing, that it looked as if the anxiety pattern in children and young people had become, that in a sense the whole bell-shaped curve had shifted towards greater anxiety by about one standard deviation, which means that whole swathes of children and young people who hadn't been anxious in the 1950s, as it were, if they were born in the 1980s, then they were likely to show anxiety, which had been virtually clinical levels 30 or 40 years ago.
I think earlier you said that what we regard as normal levels of anxiety and stress would have been regarded as a clinical level anxiety and stress 50 years ago. Is that true? Did I misunderstand that? Because that's quite an astonishing figure.
That's true in anxiety.
Yeah.
And now that we know the same is true of depression, that is that 50 years ago people would live out most of their life without getting these crushing depressions. But now that 35, 36% get depressed before the age of 18, then there's a whole life ahead of them, which is the biggest challenge, a whole life ahead of them, where they might actually get another depression. Because one of the things we now know is if you've been depressed once, you tend to get depressed again, at least in half the cases. And once you've been depressed twice, then the chances go up even further.
So does this suggest that depression is really a problem of how we deal with the world, the way we think, rather than a chemical imbalance in the way our brains are actually working?